Good afternoon, everybody. It's a pleasure for the African peer review mechanism to be invited to participate in this event. On behalf of the CEO of the APRM Continental Secretariat, Professor Maloka, I would like to express our gratitude to Mr. Abasha and his team and the African Union for inviting us. The theme retained for this session is strengthening the peer review for DRR. On that matter, I'll make a presentation, but allow me to introduce the speakers. We have Mr. Amjad Abasha, who is the Chief UNDR Regional Office for Africa. We also have Dr. Stella Mbao, who is an expert in climate adaptation and resilience. We also have Dr. Tapiwa from the African Union. So let me give them the floor to say a few words before we start our session. Mr. Abasha, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Dr. Valerie, for introducing us. I have a statement that I wanted to share with you, if that's okay. I just wanted to begin by thanking, of course, our hosts in the Regional Platform for Africa, the Government of Kenya, for their kind hosting of this event. And I also wanted to thank His Excellency, through you, His Excellency, Professor Eddie Maluka, the CIO for the African Peer Review Mechanism and its Continental Secretariat. I just wanted to also add that it's very important that we're convening this meeting or this session at the Regional Platform to introduce this new element or relative new element to regional platform and disaster risk reduction practitioners. Now, as you know, half of the world's most risk-prone countries are in Africa. We had a UNDRR report in 2020 showed that from the 10 years between 2008 to 2018, almost 160 million people were directly or indirectly affected by disasters on the continent. The impacts of these disasters are compounded, of course, today by the COVID-19 pandemic. In the sub-Saharan Africa alone, there's nearly 22 million people across the region who are internally displaced as a result of conflict and violence, which is the highest figure that we have on record. There are also record floods that triggered 4.3 million new displacements across Africa during that time. And all of these often get overlap with conflict and can trigger new and repeated displacement that in many cases become protracted. So in the face of COVID-19 pandemic, resilient recovery from the impacts of this global health crisis and other hazards would not be possible without conscious efforts and a holistic approach to boost the continent's resilience on all fronts, including social, economic, and environmental. This requires collective actions to support member states and communities in their efforts to address systemic risk and build state and community resilience. So that's why it's very important that one of the areas identified by the APRM or the African Peer Review Mechanism to strengthen its work is the integration of a new pillar on state resilience to be part of its methodology and processing, including the work going on a questionnaire which will inform its peer learning and self-assessment mechanism. And disaster risk reduction has to be an integral part of this if we are to strengthen state resilience. So the inclusion of disaster risk reduction into the APRM mechanism is really a testimony also to the APRM Secretariat commitment to embrace innovation and change. So as the focal point within the UN system for disaster risk reduction and the custodian, the Sendai framework, UNDRR supports governments to ensure their development efforts are risk-informed. We work with stakeholders at global, regional, national, and local levels to build political momentum and commitment to prevent the creation of new risk and indeed reduce existing risk. So alongside the Paris Agreement on climate change, the new urban agenda, the Sendai framework ensures that disaster risk reduction informs efforts towards achieving the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development and also Agenda 2063, the Africa we want. In order for the APRM review mechanism to include resilience as one of its pillars, we are working with partners, including the African Union Commission, to ensure that it is informed by the Sendai framework targets and indicators, as well as data on disaster losses. All these together are designed to contribute to measuring disaster-related targets and indicators. It's important also to note that these Sendai targets also have a direct link to the Sustainable Development Goals, dealing with poverty, ending poverty, making cities resilient, and taking urgent action to combat climate change and its impact. So achieving the Sendai framework targets are synonymous with reducing disaster losses, strengthening the state resilience, and realizing the SDGs. They would also be a key contributor to the new APRM thematic area entitled State Resilience to Shocks and Disasters. So under the auspices of the APRM theme, State Resilience to Shocks and Disasters, UNDRR and our disaster risk reduction partners are contributing in a number of ways, including through capacity building support to member states, in strengthening their risk knowledge to facilitate a risk-informed approach to development. This is done through improved collection of loss and damage data, as well as through support to conducting risk assessment. So in response to Africa's demands to anticipate and reduce risk, we're also working with the African Union Commission and implement a multi-hazard early warning system in partnership with member states and regional economic communities. The overall goal is really to have a continental impact-based early warning system at the African Union headquarters. The implementation of a continental early warning system in Africa will bring together sub-regional and national actors to have and form a coordinated mechanism to prevent, prepare, and respond to disasters caused by weather-related hazards. So thanks to the generous contribution of the government of Italy, this effort will also be supported through the establishment of a fully equipped 24/7 situation room at the African Union. So I wish to also emphasize that Africa has translated the Sendai framework into its own Africa-specific program of action to implement the Sendai framework. This was adopted by the heads of states in January of 2017. So to ensure we make progress towards the program of action for disaster risk reduction in Africa, development programs and policies need to be risk-informed with strong coordination and greater coherence amongst government institutions necessary to achieve this goal. We must also ensure that we're able to measure the progress we are making to achieve the Sendai 7 targets. In this regard, UNDRR, on the request of member states, we developed the Sendai Framework Monitor, which will enable countries to report on their DR progress. This Sendai Framework monitoring tool and the data that it contains could act as important elements for our joint work with the APRM, especially on the aspects related to our ongoing discussions to develop a joint program, consolidate initiatives related to building state resilience. So we must also take into account the need to support member states to report on the additional targets of the African Union Program of Action that was mentioned during this conference. So to help us take that forward, meaning the reporting on the 5 additional targets, we developed a new regional Sendai Framework Monitor tool that will enable and facilitate the reporting process in Africa in particular, and it would also reduce the reporting burden on member states. So back in July 2020, the APRM and UNDRR committed to cooperate to promote disaster risk reduction in Africa. We recognize that our institutions must work together to ensure that the peer review mechanism is able to mainstream disaster risk reduction into their processes and methodologies. We also recognize the importance of ensuring that this effort should benefit from existing DRR work being led by partners such as the African Union, as well as regional economic communities. We also offered to ensure that the work of the APRM should benefit from the existing DRR mechanisms such as the Africa Working Group on disaster risk reduction, which is the primary coordination mechanism for disaster risk reduction on the continent. So let me end by reiterating our commitment to support the implementation of the joint communique that we approved alongside the AUC, the WHO, and of course the APRM, which we held during our brainstorming experience sharing workshop on building state resilience. I very much look forward to taking this agreement forward, including at the technical level, to ensure that we reach concrete outcomes. Thank you, Dr. Barry.
Thank you very much, Mr. Amjad. In fact, if you have noticed, Mr. Amjad has given us a bigger picture of the nature of the relationship that is existing between the APRM and other institutions such as WHO and DRR. So, but allow me to perhaps make a presentation from our perspective and give you the rationale and how far we have come from in implementing DRR in APRM methodology. So I'll just share my screen now. Let's read this one. Yeah, so the COVID-19, for us at the APRM, initially, the governance is understood from four angles. We assess governance from democracy and political governance. We have another aspect, which is economic governance and management. The third is corporate governance. And then the last one, the traditional one, used to be socio-economic development. As an organ of the African Union solely dedicated to the issues of governance, as the COVID-19 outbreak, the COVID-19 broke up, we had to go through a serious introspection and analyze our questionnaire, which is our main tool for governance assessment, and see how our questionnaire was fit for purpose in the context of COVID-19. So we could humbly say that the pandemic exposed the weaknesses of the APRM process and methodology, despite its many early warning strengths. So what are the lessons learned? What we learned, one of the first lessons is that disaster and pandemics have underlined the vulnerability of African states as described in our 24 African country review reports. If you take our country review reports, you will notice, for example, in Mozambique, what happened, we see in other countries like Nigeria. So we have so many examples where it is clearly highlighted that our member states are suffering from the adverse impact of disasters in our member states. The second one is that a revised approach to governance resilience is that society should be ready and be able to bounce back better and recover after the shock. They should also be able to undergo some positive transformation from lessons learned. From there, the APRM embarks on a project which we termed as State Resilience to Shocks and Disaster with the support of our partners, namely DARBE, the African Union, UNDRR. Then, from the introspection, it was not that the concept of disaster was not addressed in the initial traditional questionnaire. What we thought is that it was discussed throughout 3 APRM thematic areas. Therefore, the understanding as approved by the Focal Points Committee and the Head of State Summit at the Forum on the 25th of March 2021 was to dedicate a thematic area on state resilience, which was finally approved by the Head of State. As I'm speaking to you, South Africa is said to be the first member state to undergo a second generation review with 5 thematic areas. The next one is that as we assess, we had some experts to assist in the process. Some few areas came strongly: state institutional capacity, early warning capacity, early action readiness, fiscal resource availability, and public awareness. So then the questionnaire tried to align with the POA and found the 4 objectives, which you can see there. Now, what is the value added of the APRM in this disaster reduction process? Our first value added is that the APRM has strong national structures which are well established in member states. We can be used for reporting purposes. Secondly, we have access to AU member states. For example, we have 41 head of state who meet on a yearly basis. and we can use so we have access to the leadership, African leadership at the highest level. Also, we have our decision, we get decisions from the AU summit. So these offer reliable channels for advocacy on disaster risk reduction matters. Finally, we have the main outcome of the country review missions, which is the country review reports and its subsequent national program of action. So our point is that we can, when we assess member states, in case DRR is not addressed in few countries, we can use that one as an opportunity for advocacy, so that those member states try to integrate as much as possible the concept of disaster risk reduction into the national development plans. So these are the few things I wanted to say, and we had some positive developments already. We organized a successful regional workshop on state resilience to shocks and disasters in West Africa, where 15 member states of the region gathered together and undertook and committed to ensure anytime they have country review missions, the 5th thematic area is incorporated. We also have discussion well advanced for participation of the AUC and UNDRR in country review missions, especially in the South African review mission, which is set to be during the 1st or 2nd week of December. So these are a few things I wanted to say. The APRM prides itself on achievements, but also is open to signals in the environment. That's why we embrace change as we did in 2020, to humbly acknowledge that our questionnaire was valid, it was relevant, but it needs to be updated. And what needs to be added to our questionnaire is the concept of disaster risk reduction. Thank you very much, colleagues, for your attention. And I want to give the floor now to Dr. Tapiwa to give us a sense of how the AUC envisions the relationship with the APRM and UNDR in the implementation of our joint commitments. Thank you very much, Doctor.
Well, allow me to start by thanking you and the main organizers for, having the African Union Commission to be part of this discussion, which is very timely indeed. And I am, of course, bringing good news and greetings from the chairperson of the African Union, His Excellency Musa Mati Mahamat, and also on behalf of my colleague who was supposed to be a regional platform, that's Kai, and is equally, attending and presenting another session prior. So I am representing my colleagues here, in this platform. Well, to start with, Dr. Valerie, I think it is to be, noted that, well, as the African Union Commission, we really welcome the inclusion of the building states resilience as a pillar in Africa peer review mechanism. This as being an added thematic area of APRM of the state resilience to shocks and disasters, of course, away from the 4 traditional pillars that thematic areas that you've been having. It has to be emphasized that here, that this inclusion will add more value due to the inclusion of the resilience in the peer review mechanism, which will bring as well as commit our member states and other partners to this important work. Further to this, I think one of the added values of the peer review is that it's going to elevate discussion on data as well as indicators at the head of state and government level, within which this added pillar will bring on board. Another important aspect I think that I needed to highlight here is that we expect that this process, being at a country level assessment process, which is very key to, translating the outcome of the Africa Biannual Report, that will translate into timely interventions by member states as well as other partners in the process. One thing that I also needed to highlight is that there is need to develop, these detailed tools that will take into account the resilience indicators, as mentioned earlier, by building on the country review reports as well as the National Program of Action and the Sendai Framework for Disaster Risk Reduction. I think this is something which is crucial, and I can, I've taken note that while in your presentation, Dr. Valerie, you've mentioned about that, and we are actually really, really pleased to see that well, we need to develop the tools that takes into consideration that the resilience indicators and also accelerating the Sendai framework for DRR, and as well as the National Program of Action, as you've mentioned. Further, I think one thing I think coming from from a gender perspective, as you know, the African Union Commission is mandated, of course, to mainstream gender across programs, in all programs and actions across the African Union. I think it is important that, well, we need, to take on board the gender, disaggregated data in the peer review process, because as such, it will actually, help in terms of having gender responsive interventions and responses that responds to gender. And as you know that well, disasters may come in, and then the effects, of course, are affected by women and girls differently also from the male side. So I think this has to be taken into consideration as we are finalizing and developing these detailed tools that they need to take into consideration, the gender disaggregated data that is needed, much needed for proper preparedness, interventions, and assessment as we move forward. I think the other part that I think I needed to also highlight is that the African Union, we are really committed to work with the APRM and also the partners, as well as the member states, in developing all these tools. So our commitment, still remains. And of course, we'll be working together in collaboration with other departments, more especially, let's say, on the gender disaggregated data. We'll also be reaching out to the African Union Women, Gender and Youth Directorate that is in charge of mainstreaming gender within the African Union at that particular level. So allow me at this point in time to hand back to you, Valerie, so that we can also interact with other colleagues who are coming to present, after me. Thank you so much, Valerie.
Thank you very much, Doctor. And it's really appreciated. I took good note of your suggestions. And I think as you were speaking, Mr. Amjad was also from the head, showing signs of approval of your recommendations. I think they are all not well taken. Let's give the floor to our colleague next door to give us understanding on give us a country perspective of disaster reduction. Thank you very much, Doctor. You have the floor.
Thank you, Valerie. Hi, everyone, and thank you for having me. I have a background in climate adaptation and resilience. So this is through research. I developed an outcasting system for flash floods for rural sub-Saharan Africa. And I'm currently working with the Banana Foundation. We support farmers at the grassroots who need knowledge on regenerative agriculture. And in particular, we work with syntropic agroforestry. So I'm pleased to be a part of this conversation. To do with peer review and of adaptation and disaster risk reduction, I'll start with the need for creating awareness on regional climate risks and for better decision-making and planning. Transnational agreements are reported to yield more progress than individual country actions. And this is probably because of a sense of mutual responsibility, and it seems to encourage accountability and better performance. The other would be empowering vulnerable groups, especially rural communities. We know that these are the most vulnerable, with early warnings for better response capability, most specifically real-time warnings. So what risk information is offered, and is it sufficient? Is it native warnings? Is it wholesome? Because we don't talk about climate change in our native languages. And most of these people who live in rural areas don't have access to this information. It's mostly in English. So, and given the understanding that what's happening is global and systemic as opposed to local and temporary, the rains are not simply late, but they're not, they're thinking they're on their way, then they're not triggered to go out of their way to come up with solutions for themselves. So the other would be adopting disaster risk governance, a participatory approach to disaster risk reduction. So this is enabling people at every level, national, local, individual, to participate in disaster risk reduction. It would mean that people are empowered with risk knowledge enough to attend to themselves, as opposed to waiting on government, which, as we know, is most oftentimes, reactive rather than proactive. It also encourages stakeholder involvement. It would help uphold social inclusion. So our vulnerable groups, the women, the youth, indigenous peoples, would be part of this conversation that means the most to them. Another would be a knowledge database. I mean, we're collecting a lot of information. A question has been mentioned. This should build up into a knowledge database on disaster risk management on a platform that's transparent, where there is data collection and monitoring. Measuring progress is easy, but this, a knowledge sharing platform that's accessible to stakeholders would encourage learning from each other. And I think with adaptation, there's the reverse outcome, maladaptation. So when you have this information from other people and this learning, it would mean that mistakes are not repeated. And I think finally, I'd like to mention multi-solving. So this is, we know what problems we have, but we also know high leverage actions that would be solutions that, the whole is greater than the sum of the parts kind of solutions. For example, promoting agroforestry that provides jobs, cleaner air, and healthy food. So it's a solution that has many benefits. And I think as I wrap up, research is another one, strengthening research and research partnerships. This is simply because information makes for better decision making. For example, big corps and rich nations intend to neutralize their emissions by planting trees, but research then by Oxfam reports that using land alone to remove the world's carbon emissions to achieve net zero would require about 1.6 billion hectares, equivalent to 5 times the size of India. So it starts to look like it's not that practical, but without research, we wouldn't know, and everyone would be banking on trees and assuming that the problem is solved, which would not work. So I think those would be my points. Thank you, Valerie.
Thank you very much, Doctor. I think we are having a very fruitful discussion during this high-level event because the recommendations are far beyond our expectations, and we'd like to appreciate to express our gratitude to the participants, especially as we sit in this meeting with a gender parity of 50-50. I think we have achieved a lot with 2 ladies among us. Okay, if you don't mind, does anybody have a question? Otherwise, I would like to perhaps give the floor to Mr. Amjad. He is the head of UNDR Regional Office for Africa. Perhaps if you can give us more clarity on when it comes to collaborating in further support to member states, because that's one of the recommendations that came out prominently from the Sierra Leone regional workshop. They were saying that institutions are in existence. However, some of the head of state do not get the support that is really needed, especially when they want. So our approach was that the AUC and the UNDR were working on a joint project on early warning system. Last week, I think last month, we had a very detailed presentations on the matter. So perhaps at that level, we can ask Mr. Amjad to just, the member states are listening to us, they are our sponsors. What can we tell them in terms of further support to address the issues that are the challenges they are facing? Thank you very much, Mr. Amjad.
Thank you, Dr. Valerie. I think you'll be disappointed because I don't think I have the answers for you on this one, but I can tell you what we're doing. And I think one of the, we have a lot of challenges in Africa. I think some was mentioned about the issue of climate change and the fact that we contribute the least, yet we're affected the most by the effects of climate change. And we're seeing it every day through droughts and extreme events like floods and other areas of risk that are increasing and multiplying. You recall in 2019, it was, we had a cyclone in the southern part of Africa, which was unprecedented in magnitude and strength. One of the, what we're doing is really a work in progress. When we're supporting governments and member states, it's a partnership issue, not only with the African Union, but also working with the, for us being a UN entity, with the regional presence, we work directly through the head of the United Nations, what we call the resident coordinator system in country. And that resident coordinator system is present in all member states of the United Nations based in Africa. And they are the ones who often have a lot of the right tools and the right interaction with the governments to support them on development issues as a whole. We provide the capacity support for disaster risk reduction, including on issues of data that has been mentioned by Dr. Stella and Dr. Tafiwa, which seems to be quite an important area. I think if I had to maybe just be very specific, I would say that there are two areas that we need to focus on during the time when we work with government to support them. There are many, many others, but I'm picking on the first two priorities of the Sendai framework. And the first one is understanding risk. And this is where all the issue of the data data and early warning systems and that you mentioned earlier comes in. And some of one of the tools that we use with governments or to support government is the helping them to establish historical databases on historical losses that occur in their countries. And we often find that these databases actually are quite sparse in terms of data collection. Somebody said earlier in a meeting that we had that data has to be continuously collected, continuously compiled, and even analyzed. So if we don't know where our risks are, where our hazards are, we will not be able to actually deal with them as effectively as we want. So this is briefly in terms of the first option. The second option, or the second priority, I think, for African countries, and not all of them, but certainly for the least developed countries in Africa, unfortunately that's many of our countries, it's the issue of governance, risk governance, and having the right connections, if I may say, between the institutions to help deliver on disaster risk reduction, to coordinate it, collaborate on it, and even to ensure that it's prioritized within resilience, if I may say, and disaster risk reduction is prioritized within national development plans, because disaster risk reduction is cross-cutting, and there is no one institution or ministry that can claim that they will be able to deliver on reducing risk without the involvement of other institutions. So the challenge here is to ensure that governments are able to come together, have a convening nucleus to it that is, executive in nature, that is able to bring all the actors together. So that's one point at the national level. But I think it was mentioned very clearly by Dr. Stella earlier, the issue of communities. She talked about all-inclusive, an all-inclusive approach, and we call it in UNDRR an all-of-society approach that needs to be included as well. So it's not just the governmental elements and institutional element, but it has to be a multi-stakeholder approach to governance as well. So these are just two specific points I wanted to raise. There are many others, but I think I'll stop there and hand over back to you, Chair.
No, thank you very much, Mr. Amjad. I think these are some avenues to address the issue of our support to member states. To Dr. Tapiwa, I want to respond to one of your questions raised regarding the integration of the consideration of gender issues in the new thematic area. I would like to say that traditionally the APRM questionnaire deals with the gender in three different areas in democracy and political governance. We also treat gender under socio-economic development, where we look at for example, the impact of the scholarized education and gender. We look at the link between displacement when it comes to displacement. Who are the segments of society that are most affected? Because, for example, we just arrived from Nigeria, and there were thousands of refugees and IDPs. And the link we established is that as there was drought in Nigeria, but also there were floods in neighboring countries, it caused displacement, and Nigeria has a lot of IDPs and refugees for a couple of years. So I think these are issues that we are trying to address, but specifically understand what you are saying, that now perhaps to look at direct linkages between gender and disasters. But also what we wanted to know is some areas remain unknown because, for example, for COVID-19, our continent has been one of the most fragile countries in terms of providing, for example, vaccine and so on. So therefore, some countries were hit by second or third or fourth wave in some instances. So what I wanted to ask you is, what will be your approach, for example, in addressing those? Do you have any framework, or how do we address those issues from the AUC perspective?
Thank you very much, Valerie, for that. I think you've mentioned, some issues that you brought to the fore, and this is, of course, something that is coming from the situational analysis and the gaps that have been, identified. And you're highlighting the issue of the vaccine. I think this is something that, as you know, we do have the Africa, CDC, and that's the main coordination point of, the response strategy that surrounds the vaccine in Africa, and of course, is part of the African Union Commission. So, I think this is something that has been, addressed through that, and we are collaborating with the Africa CDC, so that the vaccines reaches, the African Union, member states, as well as to the remotest and the drone-prone areas that, are women as well as men are. And this, of course, it's mainly to look at the coordination aspect as well with the member states that we are working with. So this is very, very crucial. In fact, the issue of coordination and communication is very paramount. I like what Dr. Stella mentioned when it came to issues of communication, simplifying matters so that our citizens on the ground are able to understand and know the risk, as well as now I'm linking with the vaccine issue that you've just mentioned. So it will be that crucial and important that we work on that. The other aspect, I think, which is a challenge that we need to all tackle, is the issue of funding. And I think in most cases, I think you can see that a lack of much, hazard funding, it's a bit challenging to tackle, most of these issues. And that is we look at it and we find that, well, quite a number of our member states do not have dedicated budget lines when it comes to, when it comes to disasters. And as such, we are from the African Union Commission trying to ensure and advocate, with our policymakers and the member state level and the regs to really dedicate, budget lines that will support in terms of disasters, and that also links to the fact of vaccines as well. So I think let me leave it here so that colleagues can also come through and intervene where possible. Over to you, Varedi.
Okay, thank you very much, Doctor, for some clarification. Dr. Estela, do you have any comments, any suggestions, or feedback to whatever has been discussed around? Because we don't get any questions from the floor, so we assume you need to, wherever possible, provide some clarification of the discussions. Okay, great news. Now we can work at the AU level. So discussion directed to me or to the AUC? Mr. Amjad, your question directed to me or to the AUC?
This is a question from the chat from one of the participants.
Okay. So, yes, you can.
Yeah, I think it's directed to you, the APRM.
Yes.
What I would like to say at this point in response to the question that is posed by the floor is at the APRM level, we are already congratulated for adopting a very inclusive approach in assessing member states for over 18 years since 2003. So the coordination mechanism, I think few things should be clarified in this discussion. We greatly appreciate that we are not the focal point on these two matters, and that at the UN level, it's the UNDRR Regional Office for Africa, and then at the continental level, it is the African Union Commission. So fully aware of what we have done, I think Mr. Amjad will recall that on the 20th of July last year, we convened a meeting, a brainstorming session to discuss on the coordination aspect, because that's also featured in the conclusion of the BNL report, stating that there's a coordination issue between the institution managing disaster risk reduction, both at the continental level, but also at the member state level. So we are fully aware of that conclusion, and we took note of it. That's why, for example, I was telling you a few minutes ago that for the country review missions, we are planning, for example, to request some consultants from the UNDRR, because they are the experts in that area. I think a letter has been addressed to Mr. Amjad to support us technically in the country review mission of South Africa, which we consider as the pilot test for state resilience. Therefore, we will greatly appreciate that in his response, he can kindly provide us with a consultant that to help us, to support us, because that's what he was also alluding to, that they have to build capacity of the AP, not only the APRM, but also member states. So these are some key areas of collaboration. What we know is that when we meet on the 20th of July 2020, the UNDR, WHO, and the AUC told us straight that what they want us to do is to assist them in the assessment of member states, because we have direct contact with member states. Or of course, they do have it, but we pride ourselves in a strong institution that were established few years. That have been there in existence for years. So we will do so, but in doing so, we would like to request support from those institutions and ensure that the document we produce reflects the needs of the continent, reflects what is already in the ground. But also, we as APRM, we also want to contribute to using the indicators in the Sendai framework to make sure our member states report on those indicators. This part of our collaboration is just a commitment Professor Maluka made on the 20th of July 2020, that as we do so, we need to infuse as much as possible the indicators on DRR into our questionnaire. And as we sit here, I think it's the right opportunity also to perhaps to bring that proposal on the table and say we have a questionnaire that has been drafted. Of course, But we also want to organize, and I think that was, I want to disclose some discussion I had Mr. Amjad and Kai a few hours ago, that we organize a workshop with UNDRR and the AUC and some experts to ensure we really take into consideration the main indicators that are in the Sendai framework, because that's why we are here today, and we don't want to participate in a meeting and not be able to include the recommendations of this meeting. Mr. Amjad, if you have some comments on that, you are welcome.
Thank you, Dr. Valerie. I think what you're saying is correct. You have put me on the spot of providing the support in a short time frame, particularly on the mission to South Africa. But I think we still have work to do in terms, if I want to speak honestly, we still have work to do on what you mentioned in your last point, which is how to include the Sendai framework indicators into the methodology and the questionnaire that you're referring to. And I think this really requires an important discussion with our experts and yours to make sure that, we make it effective, but also light. I think that's important. And we need to discuss that at the later stage. I just want to go back to the actual question, that the crux of the question that was sent through the chat. It was really about how the African Union, how APRM will coordinate with the African Union and member states. And I think in my opening statement, I mentioned the importance of including, building on existing disaster risk reduction coordination mechanism in the country. So at the regional level, we agreed in our communique with the APRM, African Union, and WHO to utilize, to create a technical working group, which I presume will, lead to further discussions on how to, apply disaster risk reduction methodologies and complement the APRM approach, particularly for the new Pillar 5. And we suggested that technical group be linked to the DRR coordination mechanisms chaired by the African Union, which we call the Africa Working Group on Disaster Risk Reduction, because it has a lot of experts as well as member states, including the science and technology, youth, and other women's groups and other communities engaged. So that would be one step to take at the regional level. At the country level, we need to explore with the APRM and other partners how to leverage the national platforms for disaster risk reduction that exist in many countries. In Africa, I believe there's at least 32 that I know of, although I have to admit that not all of them are active or as strong as they can be. So, but it does allow us an entry point at the member state level. So I think this is something that we could explore. But you also mentioned, Dr. Valerie, your own access to member states through the APRM, and that you have a strong institutional access. So I would like to learn a little bit more on that, and whether we can bring your access that you mentioned to government institutions dealing with APRM work, and how we could bring them together with the other institutions that are working on disaster risk reduction. So I think that would be the points I wanted to raise on this issue. Over to you, sir.
Oh, thank you very much, sir, and it's very much appreciated. We are committed to bring our national structures to the forum, which is something that we are going to be doing. Anytime you need information or you want to assess a country, please let us know. We'll contact our national structures, and we will bring you, we'll give you access to those structures. And when it comes to, for example, evaluating or assessing member states like we are doing for South Africa, of course, we have discussed with Kai. I know you have your national structures established. So Kai has given us the contact details of those people, and we'll appreciate that. Should you have further contacts, we use them. And during the country review missions, because our country mission are essentially consultations, both at the state level, provincial level, even at the decentralized level, where we interact with people, like in town hall meetings. That's what we normally do. So these are quantitative data, but also we use data from statistical offices. So we want to make sure we explore all the possibilities, the avenues that are offered to us at the national level to get the right data, and then make sure we report. And then the report should reflect, as I said that from the beginning, should reflect the state of the country in terms of the steps they have taken to implement the standard framework and the all global commitments. So this is what I wanted to say, Dr. Okay.
Yes.
So I wish to thank everybody, all the participants. I think we are going to do the last round of table to get your final remarks and then conclude the meeting. For me, from the APRM, I came to represent Professor Maloka. I'll go back to Johannesburg, very satisfied, very happy for whatever. I've taken note of everything and we make sure all the proposals go to the EA of the CEO to make sure we stick to our commitment and make sure this commitment works. It has to work. So let's give the floor to ladies first before we come to men. Dr. Tapiwa, you have the floor.
Thank you so much, Valerie. And I'm liking it that you're emphasizing of the gender parity in this conversation. And for someone that, I'm head of women gender policy and development at the African Union, I think I'm pleased with that. And let's continue in that, with that spirit. Well, I think from us, I think as I mentioned, I was representing my colleague Kai from the Sustainable Environment and Blue Economy Department who could not make it. And I'll be bringing back the discussion to the colleagues also within the interdepartmental working group on disaster risk management of the African Union, that indeed we are on board, we are committed, and that we are ready to work with the APRM and other partners as well, and so that we take this on board and take it seriously. And the inclusion of the resilience indicator and the pillar is very, very crucial. And we need to crystallize those indicators that they speak to the exact interventions that we'll be looking for, and so that our member states are able to report on their commitments as such. So from me, it's to say thank you once again and to all, and we'll be, really advancing this work together so that we are able to deliver for our African people and advancing the Agenda 2063 together. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Dr. Tapiwa, and let me give the floor to our colleague, Dr. Stella, for your final remarks.
Thank you. Final remarks. This being Africa and all these actions for adaptive capacity being mainly local, I can't help but think of culture and heritage and the need for migration and managed retreat at the coasts. We know that people need to move to survive. So African communities have a difficult time with this because of customary ties to land and connection to our ancestors. I feel this is important to put into account. And therefore, all the solutions we're coming up with and they need localized efforts to better ensure that cultural barriers are dealt with and to address these cultural barriers without negatively affecting the adaptive capacities of these communities. That would be my final remark.
No, thank you very much. And let's go back to our leader, Mr. Amjad, for his final remarks. Sir, you have the floor.
Thank you, Dr. Valerie, and thank you, Dr. Stella and Dr. Tapio. It's a pleasure and a privilege for me to be with you on this panel and to learn from you. And I think, Dr. Stella's last comment, emphasized not only the issue of heritage and indigenous knowledge, but also, the climate risk. We talk about disaster risk reduction, but it's also about climate risk as well. And I think we need to look into that. as we work together to take this fifth pillar on state resilience forward. And I also want to emphasize that, at least from my organization's point of view, I think it would be the wise thing to jointly really undertake the work we do in terms of capacity building projects and assessment of DRR progress in a particular country. So it's important that we do it jointly, we do it coherently, and that we do not work separately with institutions because it puts a lot of pressure on them. But what I wanted to say is, we have the Sendai Framework for Disaster Risk Reduction. It is a complete document, a complete guide for many of the things that we've discussed. And I think we could, if we use that as our guidelines to implement and support the work of the fifth pillar on state resilience of the APRM, together, I think we will find that a lot of work has been done, and that we just need to build on that depending on the country. Finally, just to thank you, Dr. Valerie, and APRM Secretariat for allowing me to be part of this. And I just want to reiterate our commitment to continue to strengthen our relationship and our cooperation. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Mr. Amjad. I think mine is simply to express the gratitude of Mr. Maloka and the APRM Continental Secretariat to all our partners, including those who did not take part in the discussion, especially WHO and other partners. We remain committed as a governance organ of the African Union. Our work is to work on governance, and wherever there are changes, we embrace the change and we take it, we move forward. So special thanks go to Mr. Amjad, to the AUC, our colleague Kai, and all his colleagues. And really, we want to thank you for this fruitful discussion. We are happy to have participated in the discussion, and the time has come to end it, hoping to take this one as a basis for further discussion. Thank you very much.